Every morning in a quiet neighborhood outside of Portland, a man opened the same creaky cupboard, reached for the same chipped mug, and poured exactly the same amount of coffee. It wasn't just routine, it was ritual. That one small action held together everything else that tried to fall apart. What no one knew was that 5 tiny habits like that, so quiet they could be missed, had kept him alive during the darkest stretch of his life. And one by one, they built something he hadn't felt in years. Control, hope, and the steady return of a life that once felt completely lost. He hadn't always lived like this. There was a time when the man who poured that morning coffee believed change could only come through force. Big decisions, sweeping resolutions, grand gestures followed by applause. He had tried all of it. Gym memberships he never used, vision boards that collected dust, books he underlined but never finished. But none of it stuck because none of it started small enough. None of it started inside. What finally saved him didn't shout. It whispered. It came in quiet, ordinary habits that didn't look like transformation until they were. This story isn't about becoming a different person. It's about returning to the one you were before life started pulling you in every direction but your own. The 5 habits you'll hear about today aren't trendy. They aren't difficult, and they won't change everything in a day. But they will change everything in time, because they don't try to fix your life. They help you re-enter it, moment by moment, ritual by ritual. Each habit began with one quiet man in one ordinary American town, fighting to find himself again, not in a breakthrough, but in the repetitive grace of tiny choices. Choices that looked too small to matter until they added up to a version of himself he could finally look in the eye. And if that sounds like the kind of change you're ready for, then keep listening, because this story, in many ways, is already yours. If his story already feels like yours, like this video and subscribe. We're walking this road together. There was a stretch of time, about 9 months, when he stopped answering the phone. Not out of anger, not because he didn't care, but because the sound of it ringing made his chest tighten. He lived alone then, in a modest apartment above a flower shop in Charleston, South Carolina. From the outside, he looked functional. He showed up for work, wore clean clothes, paid his rent on time. But inside, everything was slowing down. His thoughts, his motivation, his sense of self. What hurt most wasn't the absence of joy. It was the absence of feeling. He couldn't remember the last time something moved him. A song, a sunset, a conversation. He had become a ghost inside his own life, performing the basics while wondering silently, is this what it's going to be now? One evening, as the sun dipped below the city skyline and painted the sky in a color he couldn't name, he stood in his kitchen holding the same mug he always did. He poured coffee, as usual, but this time he held it differently. Longer, more intentionally. Like the weight of the mug reminded him that he still had weight too, that maybe he hadn't disappeared. That moment didn't save him, but it interrupted the spiral. It became the first thread in a web of small rituals that began to pull him back. Back to his breath, back to his skin, back to the idea that maybe being here, even in the quiet, even in the confusion, could be enough. Technique 1. The mug of return. It had a small crack near the handle, barely visible unless the light hit it just right. A mug from a thrift store in Lexington, Kentucky, with faded lettering that once read, "Today is yours." He didn't buy it for the message. He bought it because it fit perfectly in his hand. The kind of weight that makes you feel like you're holding something real. At first, it was just a vessel, something to hold his morning coffee. But over time, it became something else. A signal, a doorway, a beginning. Each morning, no matter how he slept or what waited outside his front door, he'd fill that mug, wrap both hands around it, and take exactly one full breath before the first sip. No scrolling, no background noise, just breath, warmth, and presence. It was such a simple act that it felt foolish to call it a habit. until he realized what it was doing to him. He was arriving again, not to the day, but to himself. It didn't change what the day would bring, but it changed who he was when he met it. On the mornings he skipped it, woke up late, rushed out the door, spilled grounds on the counter. He felt it. Not guilt, not shame, just the absence of something sacred. And so he returned to it, again and again, because it wasn't about coffee. It was about contact, with the warmth, with the stillness, with the version of him who still believed he mattered enough to begin with care. Now, wherever he goes, visiting friends in Denver, staying in hotel rooms for work, even at rest stops off unfamiliar highways, he finds a mug, any mug, and he wraps his hands around it, breathes, sips, grounds. The mug of return became his anchor. Not flashy, not profound, just consistent, just enough. Technique 2. The frame tap. The first time he did it, it wasn't intentional. He was walking from the bedroom into the hallway of his apartment in Nashville, his hand brushing the wooden door frame as he passed. A light tap. Just his fingertips, barely there. But he stopped, turned back, tapped it again, this time on purpose. It felt odd, almost embarrassing, like a superstition he didn't believe in but somehow needed. What he didn't realize was that his body had found something before his mind could name it. A moment of reset. That became the habit. The frame tap. A simple gesture every time he crossed a threshold. Into the kitchen, out the door, into a meeting room, back home. Not to make something magical happen. Not to manipulate the moment. Just to mark it. To remind himself that this is a new room, a new breath, a new chance to enter with intention. It was a pause he didn't know he needed until it became part of his rhythm. He started pairing it with a breath. One inhale, one exhale, tap, step through. Sometimes he'd whisper a word in his mind. Steady, leave it, begin. Not mantras, not affirmations, just cues to break the carryover. Because before this, he would drag the last conversation, the last mistake, the last piece of worry from one space into the next without even noticing. Rooms blurred together, feelings built up like static. But the frame tap broke that loop. It gave him permission to set things down, to walk into a new space with less weight, less noise, a little more presence. Now, every doorway became a choice. Not just a transition, but a transformation, from overwhelm to breath, from autopilot to awareness, from the past 5 minutes to the next 5 seconds. Technique 3. The 3-breath rule. It started in the most ordinary place imaginable, an intersection just outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was stopped at a red light, hands tight on the wheel, shoulders knotted, heart pacing for no reason he could name. The day hadn't gone wrong, but it hadn't felt right either. Just noise, just pressure, just too much. And without thinking, he let out a sigh that turned into the slowest inhale he'd taken all day. Then, instinctively, he did it again and again. 3 deep, deliberate breaths. That moment didn't change the light or clear his inbox or fix whatever was making his chest feel heavy. But it created space. And sometimes, space is everything. That's how the 3-breath rule was born. It became the pause he gave himself before entering a room, before answering a text, before reacting. It was his reset button, invisible to the world, but life-saving in his body. 3 breaths, not 5 minutes, not a full meditation, just 3 slow inhales and 3 even slower exhales. Enough to feel the air move, enough to remember he was here, enough to interrupt whatever loop he was about to get stuck in. He practiced it before difficult conversations, in line at the bank, while brushing his teeth, in the middle of laughter, in the middle of grief. 3 breaths to return, not to calm necessarily, but to choice. He didn't always know how to change the moment, but after those 3 breaths, he remembered he could. Now it's automatic, like muscle memory for presents. A tiny, reliable ritual that doesn't require silence or solitude, just intention. The 3-breath rule didn't make him superhuman. It just made him honest. And honest, it turned out, was more than enough. If you had to carry one sentence in your pocket today, just a reminder to help you breathe, what would it say? Share your words in the comments below. Technique 4. The pocket proof. He was visiting a bookstore in Santa Fe when he found it, wedged between pages of a used journal on a dusty shelf. A scrap of paper, torn and yellowed, with 5 words written in blue ink. You are already doing enough. He stared at it longer than he meant to, feeling like someone had written it just for him. He slipped it back where he found it, but those words followed him all the way home. And the next morning, he wrote them down again, this time in his own handwriting, and folded them into his jacket pocket. That's when the pocket proof began. It was never about affirmations. It was about reminders. Proof that he could hold in his hands on the days his head lied to him. He started carrying short notes, written on receipts, torn notebook corners, sometimes even napkins. They said things like, "You've done harder things. You don't need to rush. You're allowed to rest." Sometimes he'd read them in a crowded waiting room. Other times, he'd just reach into his pocket and feel the paper there. And that was enough. Just knowing it was near. The pocket proof became more than a comfort. It became a ritual of belief. A tiny rebellion against the doubt that had followed him for years. He began leaving notes in library books, on cafe tables, folded into tip jars. Because if he needed proof, maybe someone else did too. He didn't need grand declarations. He just needed to hear, from himself, "You are not invisible. You are still here. You are still trying." And some days, that's the loudest truth of all. Technique 5. The nightly nod. It always happened the same way. Lights off, sheets pulled up, the hum of the ceiling fan in his apartment in Des Moines spinning its steady rhythm above him. And just before he let the day slip away, he'd whisper 3 words into the dark. "You showed up." That was the nightly nod. A quiet acknowledgement, not of success or productivity or perfection, just of presence, just of the fact that, in a world that constantly demands more, he was still here, still trying, still moving forward, even when progress was invisible. At first, it felt strange, talking to himself like that. But over time, the sentence took on weight, meaning. On good days, it felt like a celebration. On hard days, it felt like a lifeline. And on the days when nothing made sense, when everything felt off, that whisper reminded him that effort mattered too. That showing up isn't small, it's sacred. The nightly nod didn't change what had happened that day. It didn't erase mistakes or fix the things left undone. But it softened the voice that used to punish him the moment his head hit the pillow. It became a new rhythm, one of compassion, of completion, of grace. And now, no matter where he is, sleeping in a guest room in Boston, on a couch in Phoenix, or in his own bed under the same ceiling fan, he says it every night. You showed up, sometimes followed by thank you, sometimes by nothing at all. Because he finally understood something that took him years to learn. The world may never see the way he carried the day. But he saw it. And that is enough. It was a cold Tuesday morning in late February when everything finally caught up to him. Chicago doesn't forgive in winter. The sidewalks don't just get icy. They disappear under weeks of forgotten snow. And that morning, as the city howled outside his window, Matt sat on the edge of his bed, fully dressed for work, completely unable to move. He wasn't tired, not in the traditional sense. His body wasn't aching, he wasn't sick, but something deeper had unraveled inside him, something silent and heavy and invisible. He had missed a single deadline the day before, a presentation he had poured himself into, and his manager had responded with a curt email. Disappointed Matt. noted. That was all it took. Not the months of overtime, not the weekends he'd worked through, not the long nights reworking slides until his eyes stung. All of that was erased by one word: disappointed. And for the first time in years, he questioned it all. Not the job, but himself, his value, his effort, his voice. He sat there, still for what felt like an hour. No music, no phone. Just a man in a button-up shirt and slacks, sitting on the edge of his mattress, asking silently, "What's the point if I'm never enough?" It wasn't the first time he'd felt that way. But it was the first time he realized he had no answers left to push the feeling away. That night, he didn't go to work. He didn't call in either. He walked through Lincoln Park, letting the wind whip around his face, tears mixing with sleet as if the sky itself refused to let him be alone in it. That walk was where something inside him cracked, but not in a way that broke him down, in a way that let something finally break out. He remembered something his grandfather once told him when he was 10, sitting on a folding chair in a backyard in Bloomington. "You're not here to be perfect, kid. You're here to pay attention. The rest comes later." It had never made sense to him. Not then. But that sentence returned, clear as day, louder than the wind, louder than the voice in his head telling him he'd failed. "You're here to pay attention." And in that moment, he started to. He noticed the way his breath fogged the air, the crunch of snow under his boots, the kindness in the stranger's eyes who passed him and nodded. He noticed the life he had forgotten to look at, because he was too busy performing one he thought was expected. That night, Matt did something small, but quietly revolutionary. He wrote a note to himself on a sticky pad and stuck it to the mirror. "I'm allowed to begin again." That wasn't a moment of triumph. It wasn't the climax of a movie. It was soft, gentle, undramatic. But it was real, and it was his. That sentence stayed on the mirror for 3 weeks, and by the 4th, he had written another, and then another. These weren't affirmations. They weren't platitudes. They were proof that he was rebuilding something inside of himself. Not quickly and not publicly, but deeply, quietly, honestly. It didn't erase the pain. It didn't fix the job or remove the weight overnight. But it gave him a thread. A single, golden thread to hold on to. A thread that reminded him that he didn't need to escape his life. He just needed to come back to it. And maybe reshape it from the inside out. At first, no one noticed. Matt still went to work, still answered emails, still nodded at the barista on the corner of North Avenue, and Clark who knew his order before he spoke. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. He had stopped waiting for permission to rest, to feel, to begin again. And because of that, he had also stopped proving. Not in a bitter way, not in defiance, but in peace. There was a stillness in him now, a kind of quiet courage that doesn't need to announce itself. It began showing up in subtle moments, like when a meeting ran late, and for the first time, he stood up and said, "I have to go. I promised myself I'd cook dinner tonight." He said it without apology, without over-explaining. And something incredible happened. The world didn't fall apart. His co-workers didn't shame him. In fact, one of them smiled, genuinely, and said, "Good for you, man." The thread was working. It weaved itself into his mornings, where he no longer reached for his phone before his feet touched the ground. Into his commutes, where he swapped out the flood of productivity podcasts for simple silence, or music that made his shoulders drop instead of tense. And most of all, it showed up in how he talked to himself. He stopped using his name only in reprimand. No more "Matt, seriously?" or "Matt, come on." He started using his name in praise, in softness. "You did good today, Matt. That was brave. I'm proud of you." One Saturday, he was walking along the lakefront in Chicago when he caught his reflection in a cafe window. Same coat, same posture, but something about the way he was looking out across the water. It felt like a man finally standing with himself, not against. That version of him didn't feel fake. It felt familiar, like someone he'd known before the world taught him to perform. He began journaling, not long essays or morning pages, just 3 lines a night. What I noticed, what I felt, what I want to remember. Those tiny sentences became a map. They revealed patterns, like how often he felt proud after a walk, or how much tension came from saying yes when he wanted to say, not today. He started giving that version of himself room to breathe. He stopped filling every gap with noise. He stopped hustling in moments that needed holding. He didn't need to fix every hard feeling. He learned to feel them instead. And to his surprise, they moved through. Quicker, cleaner, and far less destructively than when he buried them under performance. He smiled more, not because he was trying to be liked, but because he liked himself more. And that wasn't ego. It was return. A return to something small and sturdy that had been waiting inside him all along. At work, the same manager who once sent the disappointed email noticed the change, but not in the ways Matt expected. One afternoon, during a one-on-one, she leaned in and said, "You seem clearer, like you're making choices instead of chasing." Matt didn't say much. He just nodded, because that was it. That was exactly it. He had stopped chasing validation like a finish line he could never reach. And instead, he started choosing himself, choosing rest, choosing boundaries, choosing presence over performance. And because of those choices, he became someone new. Not a stranger, not a reinvention, but a deeper, truer version of himself. A version that doesn't crumble under disappointed, because he no longer needs anyone else's approval to feel whole. A version that greets his reflection with respect, that says no without guilt, that says yes without fear. The kind of man who still has hard days, of course, but who trusts himself enough to walk through them. And the more he embodied this version, the more life began to respond in kind. Friends began opening up to him in new ways. His creativity, once buried under pressure, returned in bursts. Poems scribbled on napkins, ideas for side projects, little sparks of joy. And joy, he learned, didn't need to be loud. Sometimes it's just a quiet satisfaction, like warm coffee on your front porch or folding laundry while your favorite song plays. This was the life he always wanted, but never thought he deserved until he earned it. And now, without permission, he simply stepped into it. The thread, it was always there, woven into Matt's life long before he noticed it. It lived in the softness of Sunday mornings, in the quiet ache after a long run, in the steady rhythm of dishes being washed while jazz played low in the background. It was never loud, never urgent. It didn't beg for attention like disappointment did. It whispered, patiently, consistently, waiting for him to listen. And now, here he was, months later, standing in the very same hallway at work where he once felt the floor drop out at the sound of a single word. Disappointed. Only this time, something was different. This time, he heard another word. One not spoken out loud, but felt deep in his chest. Aligned. He wasn't perfect. He hadn't become some enlightened monk floating above the chaos. But he was aligned. With his values, with his energy, with the version of himself he trusted, even in the dark. That hallway had once felt like a spotlight exposing every flaw. Now it felt like just another space he walked through. Not a test, not a trap, just a corridor. And that shift, that's what 5 small habits had done. They hadn't changed his life overnight. They changed his direction. A pocket pause, a 1-line journal, a 5-word note on a bathroom mirror, a rule to leave when the room no longer feels safe, A commitment to let the day end and not carry it to bed. Individually, they seemed small, too small to matter. But the thread ran through them all. And when stitched together, they formed something far more powerful than he'd imagined. A life with less proving and more presence. Less noise, more meaning. He didn't always notice the transformation happening in real time. Most days felt like normal days. But one morning, as he stood at the mirror brushing his teeth, he realized he liked who he saw. Not just the outer him, but the posture. The way his shoulders weren't clenched. The way he breathed, unhurried. The quiet assurance in his eyes. That's what change looks like sometimes. Not thunder, not fireworks, just peace. And the metaphor, that invisible thread, wasn't just a concept. It became his anchor. The thing he pulled when the wind picked up. The thing he traced with his fingers when doubt crept in. The thing he strengthened, day by day, habit by habit, until it held. That thread was always his. The world didn't give it to him. The job didn't supply it. No one else could tie it tighter. Only he could do that. And if you're listening, if any part of this story feels like it was stitched from your own fabric, then maybe, just maybe, you've had that thread too. Tucked away, waiting. It might be frayed, it might feel fragile, but it's there, and it's enough. Because one small thread, woven with intention, tugged with hope, anchored with action, is strong enough to start a whole new pattern. A life not built on performance, but on presence, on alignment, on peace that doesn't shout, but stays. So, take the first stitch. It doesn't need to be big, just intentional, just real, because that's how lives are changed, not with revolutions, but with threads. If this thread touched your heart, subscribe and like. We're just getting started together.